Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Robert Nelson, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yale Lectures on Late Antique and Byzantine Art, and to today's presentation. Some of you may, unfortunately, I have to say, have tried to hear the lecture I gave last month in the series, which failed for technical reasons. That lecture, we hope to be able to reschedule in the near future, and we will give you, we will send out notices of that. But today, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Vasilios Marinas, who will introduce today's lecture. Vasilios.
Thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce both the speaker and the respondent. Dr. Ravinder currently serves as visiting assistant professor of global pre-modern art at The Ohio State University. He received his PhD in 2019 in medieval and Byzantine art from Stanford University. His research has been supported with a 2016-2019 Paul Mellon Predoctoral Fellowship from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., as well as a jointly appointed fellowship by Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations in Istanbul and the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence. His first book project is called The Byzantine Art of Fear. The book will address how fear became a desired aesthetic effect of medieval Mediterranean art and architecture. An article associated with this book project will soon appear in Speculum. He's also developing a project on the global impact of The Ladder of Divine Ascent, written in 7th century Sinai by John of the Ladder. This book will offer a new reading of this medieval bestseller, tracing its formative impact on the development of mysticism in the medieval world, as well as its afterlife in art into the early modern period. Our first piece of research from this project will appear in Dumbarton Oaks Papers 76, and I might add here that this is truly a fine piece of scholarship. Finally, he's working on a project devoted to the salvaged art of medieval Nubia, a tradition largely excluded from the late antique and Byzantine canon. The book will focus on the sites Faras, Old Dongola, and Ban Kanarti in modern Sudan, and their traditions of epigraphy, fresco painting, and building traditions. These themes were the topic of a recent conference that he organized, bringing together archaeologists, art historians, and epigraphers last month at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, entitled Medieval Nubia in a Transcultural Horizon, Art, Architecture, and Epigraphy. Our respondent, Dr. Foteini Spingou, is currently a learning technologist at the Digital Education Service at the University of Leeds and an honorary fellow at the School of History, Classics, and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. She's a historian of the medieval East Mediterranean region. Her research places in direct dialogue texts and images, thus revealing cultural networks across Eurasia, discovering long-lost cultural artifacts, revealing hidden mechanisms of imperial propaganda, and unveiling disclosed agendas that allowed the past to survive to our present day, all with the help of digital humanities. Dr. Spingou has held numerous scholarships, including at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., and at Princeton, and she has published extensively in prestigious journals. But all Byzantinists and medievalists in general are eternally grateful to Dr. Spingou for shepherding this monumental project, the visual culture of later Byzantium. We are delighted to welcome both Dr. Binning and Dr. Spingou virtually to Yale.
So thanks very much, Professors Marinis and Nelson. I will share my screen now. Everything is clear? So
yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. It's my real honor to be part of this series with such eminent scholars, and I hope to share some of my research today that I'll be including in the first book that you mentioned. So thanks again for this invitation. My focus today is how Last Judgment became a model for practices of image making in the Middle Byzantine period. The material I present is hardly a globalizing theory for artistic production or authority, but it does seek to challenge a stereotype basically imparted by first Ormond Dalton in a 1925 book called East Christian Art. By the Comenian period, bemoans Dalton, quote, sacred art itself became a kind of ritual, memorized and performed with an almost unconscious direction of the faculties, end quote. Dalton here blames the liturgical system in place for dictating such dry formalism. This quote may indeed seem rather odd and irrelevant to exhume now, yet even in his far more generous field-defining work in a book of a great influence on me, Art and Eloquence in Byzantium, Henry Maguire concluded something similar. Middle Byzantine artists, he insists, were not necessarily conscious of the rhetorical origins informing the rather dramatic effects behind their paintings. Today, I will trace a tradition that challenges these points. I will look closely at a few objects and textual sources attesting to a psychosomatic process of making and copying, mastery and authority as determined by the Last Judgment image. The evidence suggests that sustained engagement with the scene reflected what we may call a craft or practice of fear. To copy and to master the scene, to impart it to viewers, was also to demonstrate spiritual labor and to model a psychophysical process. Thus, I will not be focusing on how depicting Last Judgment constructed an experience of authority in the sense of the scene being able to manifest divine law or warning. Rather, the very control and replication of its formalism, its reduction into space and material, attested to its maker's ability. Insight, meditative immersion, and inspired foreknowledge into this unrevealed scene were deeply desired. So too, the experience of fear in the act of beholding. Little wonder then that emperors and monks would both take part in this craft of envisioning that became modeled in perfect form through material objects. The Second Coming has long been considered, and rightly so, the supreme object of fear, or one of them, in Christian visual culture. The legendary episode about the Bulgarian king's conversion to Orthodox Christianity in the 10th century Theophanes Chronicle confirms this point. We know the Bulgarian king Boris demands a Christian monk to paint a scene to paint any scene, so long as it strikes the viewers with phobos and ekplexis, terms that will be important today. The monk painted the Last Judgment because he knew of nothing more fearsome, and then the king's conversion ensued. Nevertheless, the Last Judgment is not typically the scene with which we think about the art historical issues of making, authorship, or ownership, let alone how the experience of fear could constitute a form of aesthetic appreciation. As the magnificent ivory that I'm projecting, however, attests, by the period we call Middle Byzantine, the scene appeared in miniature, personalized, even luxurious media. The precise origin of this work remains debated. Some see it as a product of 10th century Constantinople, while others call it a product of 11th century Italo-Byzantine facture, analogous to the monumental scene at Torcello. I will support the location in Constantinople, even if the horizontal carving does not usually align with what we expect to be the courtly carving craft that celebrates the verticality of the grain. What can be said for sure, however, is that this block of ivory reduces the end of the world into a space half of the size of a sheet of notepaper. Thus, at one level, inspiring my lecture is the need to account for this ivory's astonishing formal features, a fact that made the Last Judgment into an object of focus and desire. The carving is certainly virtuosic. The rhythms of high and low relief, the variety of expressions, the demarcations of space, of punishment and paradise, the pulsations of movement, as well as a kind of ludic way the image simultaneously and guides and bars our entry. The image's competing viewpoints disorient us. The image masters us by undoing our subjective control. Even if we cannot be sure of its original viewing location, these factors alone attest to an important point. The object fostered a privileged viewpoint and a uniquely personalized practice of beholding. Space and time become suspended when one gazes into this otherworldly space. Here, given the autonomy of iconic presentation, the supreme image of fear has now become something of an aesthetic marvel. Despite alluring small works, however, architectural examples continue to dictate how scholars discuss fear as an aesthetic experience made sacred by medieval art more broadly. And here's the famous, example from the Latin West. They considered the Last Judgment usually a reflection of the church's moral rhetoric and a means of communication and persuasion, injunction and subsequent response. This point has become canonical in our surveys. Giselbertus's inscription at the Burgundian Cathedral of Saint-Lazare d'Autun exemplifies this rhetoric. Terror becomes imperative here and one inextricably bound to the experience of seeing. It reads, "May this terror terrify those whom earthly error binds, for the horror of the images here in this manner truly depicts what will be," end quote. A far less studied 12th century monument in Cyprus, to take things to the east, spatializes a textual command to tremble. The dome of the Panagia Theotokos at Trikomo from about 1105 shows a Pantocrator portrait with a dodecasyllabic inscription reading, "He who sees all from the distant places sees all who enter. He examines their souls and the movements of their heart. Mortals tremble with fear before the judgment." To read this inscription in situ requires a disorienting or demands a disorienting and even dizzying process. The viewing subject's command over the image and text becomes disrupted, even disjointed, by having to constantly follow the dome's circularity. But in these two examples, the experience of fear here supports a habitus, a model of subject formation that cuts to the very etymology of our word subject, in sub and yakare, to be thrown under, quite literally. The viewing perspective and movement in space open vis-a-vis the dome, however, is altogether different from the privileged view into the second coming established by the ivory. Now, the topic of the Last Judgment's appearance in sacred spaces after 900 is one far too complex to engage today. I'm concerned with smaller scale works. I'm showing you here the famous Hagios Stephanos in Kastoria, which many scholars associate as kind of the first monument to show an immersive experience of Last Judgment spanning the entire narthex. And Niambala's brilliant recent book recovers numerous monumental contexts and how they relate to individual communities of viewers. Yet we still need to account for the privatization of fear as mediated by works that open an alignment between viewer and the Last Judgment according to more intimate conditions. Likewise, despite excellent research into selfhood, art, and eschatology in Byzantium, inquiry into the aesthetic attitudes that made fear a personalized priority, even desired possession, demands more careful attention. Due caution is to be expected after all. Whenever we speak of fear in history, it would be a problem to claim that epigrams speak as true reflections of long-lost viewers, let alone give access to their bodily experience, or as Wittgenstein would make a problem, the relationship between language and the private experience of sensation. Yet the presence of words for fear continue to surround Byzantine art. The question is, how do we approach it? Scholars are usually fine with leaving things at, art producing eschatological fear or reverential fear and examining fear thus in relation to viewer response. This tendency cannot be divorced from yet another, even broader approach forged at the nexus of anthropology and art history. That scholarly priority is focused always on the power of images. But over-reliance on terms like response and reception, an image's power or inherent efficacy, do not convey just how complex the phenomenon of fear actually was. For understanding fear as a kind of viewer reception risks reducing something like phobos into something sudden, into a reflex reaction. Furthermore, emphasis on viewer response locates the source of an image's power in the image itself. The method, if unconsciously, therefore displaces power from the maker and from culturally contingent desires and economies of ownership. At its most extreme, focus on viewer response shifts attention from objects altogether in a search for transhistorical responses, for the substrate behind the sudden, involuntary, or motorized responses to images, that is, the stuff of neuroaesthetics. Today, I will venture the argument the fear we are uncovering was hardly a response in the way that we understand the term at all. Likewise, our modern expectations about fear hardly align with the medieval conception. In Greek, fear can be called phobos, tromos, phrike, ptoe, ekplexis, even thauma. Many of these terms are far more psychosomatic than the phobos that Aristotle may have had in mind when he defined pathos, threat, and persuasion in the third book of the Rhetoric. Instead, fear was a condition, an experience of aesthesis or sensation. It was not purely an emotion in the Aristotelian definition of a change of state. Christian discourses, practices, and images, as we will find, heightened this condition to a symptom made mystical. Those who possessed and cultivated this symptom could make special claims to authority. The material I will trace suggests that what began as an ascetic pursuit became a courtly one by the 10th and 11th century, at least in Constantinople. Fear was particularly compelling for several reasons. Of course, there's the ever-present scriptural injunction to fear the Lord, but this again accounts for a small aspect of the Byzantine aspiration. The experience of phobos or phrike fascinated the medieval mind because it was the condition par excellence for affirming a principle. That principle was sympatheia, that soma and psyche are fundamentally intertwined. Sympatheia cuts to the very grounds upon which the Middle Byzantine source like the Suda, for example, defines condition. And here I just quote, "Since the link of the soul to the body is not unrelated but sympathetic, the traces pass from the soul's movements to the body and from the body to the soul. One is the form of thought and the other of suffering. And for the rest, the trace of the soul's movement appears in the body." End quote. This thinking informed how sources described fear. Interior and exterior experiences were intertwined when the anguished state of fear manifested. Shivers of dread, profuse weeping, tremorous reactions all confirm a kind of physicality. Thus, the fear under study aligns more perhaps with another condition, namely melancholia. An object of speculation and inquiry since the dawn of Greek medicine and natural philosophy, the mysterious melancholia was an experience beyond emotion. It was psychophysical. The humoral hardening of the bilious condition could find release in tears, but also incite flights of imagination, even inspired mania. But melancholia also confirmed the body and imagination's fundamental interconnection. It did so in the experience of aesthesis, or sensation confirmed this connection, specifically the experience of a weighty and pained sensation. Thus, one cannot conceive of something like sympatheia without understanding sensation. But the interior capacity of the imagination was also important. The imagination influenced the condition of the soul, profoundly so, but also could yield visible changes in the body. Hence the need to police and to purify phantasma, lest images produce sensations evocative of lascivious bodily experience. The perfected remembrance of the Last Judgment would assure this purity. Even its visual form could lead to a cathartic engagement with the event's foreboding threat, leading to the rush and release of penitence. None of this thinking was lost on men like Constantine VII and his learned circle. As though in pursuit of an alchemical secret, their cultural production shows a desire to purify soma and psyche according to certain exemplars. Imperial patronage and active research into methods of penitence and fear had little to do with referencing scripture and establishing theological dogma. Rather, penitence and fear constituted a therapeia for the soul and body, grounded in the purification of perception. Manipulating psychosomatic sympathy was a component of what they believed was a Christian philosophical life. And when I use this kind of concept of philosophical life, I'm thinking also of Pierre Hadot's book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, who traces sort of the afterlife of Stoicism into medieval exercises of the self, he calls them. The projected example attests to how penitential experience became raised to philosophical pursuit. It appears in a canonical example, the verse of folio 136 in the Paris Psalter. In the first scene, we see David visited by Nathan, illustrating the account in the second book of Samuel, when the court prophet tells the king of his iniquity. The illustration accompanied Psalms 51 to 53, penitential verses in which David focuses on God's omniscient vision over sin and begs to be purified and washed. The Psalms themselves revolve around the connection between spirit and heart. Perfection was a psychosomatic condition in this case, and one visible to God's watch. And the second part of the scene pictures the state of contrition itself. Here, in the classic aristocratic codex, again, a canonical example, metanoia or repentance appears as a personification. Thus, contrition, or the anguish for sin, is hardly a generic form of sorrow at all, but here a haloed state that condescends to our recognition through personification. Indeed, her feminine embodiment makes her presentation here equal to the other personifications contained in the book. For example, where we see in an earlier folio Sophia and Propheteia. When personified, metanoia models penitential affect herself, with one finger elegantly placed to her chin. Metanoia also appears as an adjudicator above the emperor on his knees. The sackcloth, which Samuel describes David having worn in his 7 days of penitence, has now been replaced by the royal purple. David's penitential pose thus modeled to the imperial viewer the Old Testament king as an exemplar of a mournful yet redemptive condition. Other objects from the same period, and I'm just showing one of the two almost identical ivory plaques, the other in St. Petersburg, model the sympathetic principle in far more visceral ways. These demonstrations were concomitant with the rise of the miniature devotional image and its dramatic isolation of religious scenes for individual viewers. An astonishing example is the ivory carving depicting the Roman legionnaires forced to freeze overnight, the 40 martyrs of Sebaste. These are the only works to survive in which martyrial passion itself becomes the focus of iconic presentation. This is not to say that images of martyrs are not depicted in ivory at the same time. It's just that here, the actual climax of the narrative is presented. The enshrinement of their writhing forms in superb carving and in a mass of expensive materials tells us, an expensive material, tells us that the scene modeled something beyond the mere punctum of the narrative. These bodies suspend the gaze on a specific condition. The object models that condition in 40 different ways. That condition is friqué or shivering. The objects compel viewers to negotiate the psychophysical duality inherent to the term. It is, in one level, a condition cruelly forced onto the martyrs in their freezing trial, but it is also a psychosomatic state repeatedly evoked in this period to express fear. Friqué becomes redemptive by the martyr's example. Through up-close viewing, the owner joins the tortured group. Through identification with their mortal forms, he finds himself implicated at a similarly distant and alienated position from Christ above. And through their shivering forms, he learns to perform redemptive penitence according to a kind of pained choreography. Such shifting resemblances between literal freezing and spiritual suffering may seem a far-off connection, if it were not for the fact that every pose and every panic-stricken expression here corresponds to patristic writing about penitential techniques. Byzantine authorities believed that the proper arousal of eschatological fear and mourning for sin could not be contained in prayer alone. These states instead ought to become expressed through displays of physical excess. One must weep, strike the breast, shiver in terror, groan out, writes John Chrysostom in his advice to the monk Stegurius, just to cite one source. Chrysostom was not provoking pathoi toward doctrinal persuasion in such a letter. He was ordering manipulation of sensation, of one's psychophysical makeup in order to enact spiritual change. Seeing these poses as doubles reveals how the figures themselves present sacred fear as a set of ritualized, reproducible gestures. They are figural means for guiding an orthopraxis that promised the worshiper the imminent experience, if in part, and to a lesser degree, of the martyr's redemptive sacrifice. The principle of sympathy, of mind and body connected at the point of sensation, dictated conceptions of fear in religious discourse, and as I want to explore aesthetic situations concerning the Last Judgment. It is according to sympathy that fear became a pursuit in specific exercises conjuring the Last Judgment in the imagination, a conjuration that the material work of art replicated and presented to the viewer in perfected form. Before I trace how this tradition, this craft of fearful imagining, moved from monastery to courtly context, another definition must be provided. The production of fear in relation to Last Judgment can be explained in a term I just used, namely orthopraxis. Here, I'm importing a concept from Raimundo Panikkar by way of Paul Gale, who elaborated upon the concept of orthopraxis in a fascinating essay about monastic traditions of silence written in 1987, entitled Competens Silentium, and he's writing about the Latin tradition. For Panikkar, the great religious comparatist, in orthopraxis differed from orthodoxy in the following way, and Gale summarizes the point, which I quote: "An orthodox believer seeks to reproduce the experience of learning from the teacher, whose teaching lives on in authentic texts, verbal traditions, or creeds. An orthopractical adept, by contrast, seeks to achieve an imminent experience of the divine equivalent to that of the founder, usually by following a devotional practice presumed to be similar to his or hers." End quote. To render the Last Judgment within form and paint, or ivory, let us say, is not simply to facilitate a scriptural or dogmatic hermeneutical experience. Of course, the scene has a codified iconography, coordinates in Matthew and Daniel, but works of art consistently construct a viewing position, one replicating a vision understood to be authoritative. One work of art opens the issue nicely. The work on wood shows the Last Judgment in tempera and is today at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. It was likely produced at the end of the 11th or early 12th century, and now this object is hardly unknown as excellent research by George Galaveris, Maria Lidova, Sofia Kalopisi-Verti, among others, all have approached different aspects of this work. Indeed, the hexaptych as a full assemblage is so complex an object that it will be the subject of a forthcoming monograph by Zaza Skiertladze, and his helpful essay in Dumbarton Oakes papers from several years ago elaborates some stakes of that book. And therefore my remarks will hardly be as thorough. Just to give you some background, the work exists as a part of a 6-part assemblage called a hexaptych. And when assembled, the object comprises 6 panels, with the 4 interior panels showing the Menologion, the entire year of martyr celebrations. Originally, it was meant to keep time, in a sense. Here's panels 2 through 4. The pictograms, each capturing an individual martyrdom scene, stood for individual feast days. The outermost panel, pictures the end of both the ritual cycle and time itself, namely the Last Judgment. So the outer panel is the Last Judgment, and each day a candle would be lit before a new, for an individual martyr, rather than having to constantly bring in a new icon for that saint's feast day. So the outermost panel pictures the end of both the ritual cycle and time itself, namely in the form of the Last Judgment. The image, divided by the river of fire, bears the same sense of disjunction of otherworldly topographies found on the ivory. On the hexaptych, verses survive all over in Greek and in Georgian. These verses identify the painter, a high monk named Johann Tochabi. Given his ability to write in Georgian as well as in Greek dodecasyllable, he likely came to Sinai after some time in Constantinople. And various epigrams appear on the back of the object, including on the reverse of the Last Judgment scene itself. The poems would be visible to any viewer who went behind the object in the chapel at Sinai, which displayed it and parsed its dodecasyllabic verse. However, one poem contains something truly extraordinary, a statement from the monk himself on what it meant to paint the Last Judgment. I quote, "As Daniel, who foresaw your terrible judgment, O almighty abyss of mercy, having it in mind and written on the tablets of the heart, miserable among monks, Ioannis, has reverentially painted your second coming, and begs you, O maker of the universe, to be a merciful, not wrathful judge on that day." In one sense, the monk has done the iconographic work for us by citing the source of the image in Daniel's dream, which included the river of fire and the judgment assembly. But the poem here suggests that what appears on the panel's surface is not simply a scriptural message. Essential here, rather, is the strategic use of the term proede, to foresee. The monk thus claims his act of painting records an oniric, visionary, even prophetic experience. In this respect, he is following the precedent of the orthopraxis. The epigram and image have little to do with dogma and everything to do with claiming a share in the inspired prophet's vision. It defines the ontology of the image as posing a replication for the viewer to share that image as well. However, to transfer the vision was not without affect. This point becomes clear when we consider how the poem conjoins judgment with friké, the shivering terror. The poem enshrines the subject, therefore, as fearsome. By extension, the epigram enshrines the act of painting as materializing an immaterial vision. However, most importantly, the epigram claims that the painting transfers the energy of an anguished process. Put briefly, it makes a claim that the image is as much illustrative of the Last Judgment as it is indexical of a psychosomatic state. But how is this epigram making a claim to fear and thus extending what we may call artistic authority? Whether the Georgian monk was copying his scene from a model book is beside the point here. The epigram is inscribing the act of making within a far more mystical psychosomatic economy. The act of painting records a sacred vision, but also imparts it to the viewer. In this very respect, Tochabi is claiming an ability to replicate Daniel's experience, and thus is establishing authority as revealing the coordinates for an orthopraxis. Essential to that statement of authority is how, by presenting the image, he is also a guide to the acquisition of friké itself. This point is crucial for my discussion and deserves some elaboration. Friké, the terror that inflects the image, informs the act of making. But fear here confirms the process of turning the image of the Last Judgment into a memory. Attaining this mnemonic symptom would be akin to perfecting the mnemonic image. The epigram clearly reflects the sympathetic cardiocentric theory of memory when the monk says, having it in mind and written in the tablets of the heart. Bala's excellent chapter on this object accounts in part for how this line drew on monastic writing about the cardiocentric model of memory inherited from antiquity. But as I will now examine, the monastic milieu stretched the challenge of mnemonic acquisition to mystical heights. In other words, To claim the image was grafted into mind and heart, again, evidence of memory as a sympathetic phenomenon, became far stranger than Aristotle's rather innocent conception of memory as a typos or impression. In that respect, the Last Judgment itself was the supreme object to think about memory and the imagination, as well as the body. Monastic sources far before the Georgian monk wrote these lines at Sinai would describe the process of mnemonic acquisition with far harsher words, conferring upon the sensation a psychosomatic language of violence, pain, even the weight of a tumor. Paradoxically, perhaps to us, this language set forth a challenge by examples. The primary source outlining this practice comes from the very site where this object was made. Indeed, we can decipher the connection between psychophysical fear, memory, and the making of the Last Judgment in the most influential treatise on monasticism in Greek. That text is the Klimax, or the Ladder of Divine Ascent, written in the early decades of the 7th century at the Vatos Monastery, now called St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, where our panel was produced. Its author, John, popularly called Tu Klimaku or Climacus of the Ladder, lived between 579 and 650, a time scholars tend to mark as the end of late antiquity and the Byzantine period. And that's really Peter Brown's famous demarcation. He himself associates the Ladder with the end of the desert Christian period and the beginning of Byzantium more properly. And those dates are according to the recent, very authoritative text of Jonathan Zecher, who also deals with eschatology and the Ladder in his recent book. And I benefit from much of his work here. The treatise is structured according to steps on a ladder. After passing the highest threshold, the monk was promised weightless enlightenment, even mystical contact with Christ himself. But across its pages, one does not read much in the way of theological commentary or complex exegesis. Rather, it is imparting a series of orthopraxes. Climacus sets down a tradition, or claims to, associated with the deserts of Egypt, that is, before the era of organized monasticism ensued. This is not the typica of later formal monasticism. The Ladder of Divine Ascent rather organized and thus rendered accessible knowledge that had previously been scattered, passed down through gnomic utterances. The Klimax teaches through definitions, reflections, warnings, and vivid anecdotes in a way clearly indebted to precedents of desert literature. Like other classics of mysticism in other cultures, the Klimax frames the path as dangerous, even deadly to the uninitiated. It is rigorously psychosomatic. But nowhere are the contours of an orthopraxis of fear and imagining more brutally defined than when, in the early steps of the treatise, Climacus devotes serious attention to penthos, metanoia, and memory. The memory of death, as he calls it, is not another reminder to live virtuously. It assures, when we read between the lines, prosoche, the Stoic ideal of focused control and attention. In this case, the control and purification of phantasma. Of course, Climacus was hardly the first to uphold the Last Judgment into a mnemonic image. Traces of instructions for imaginative conjuration of hell flame and worms are to be found already in the account of young Anthony's ascetic techniques just at the fringes of his village. So too, in Pachomius, Shenouda, and the Apophthegmata Patrum, we find emphasis on imagining Last Judgment in brief expositions. But it was Climacus who offers detailed instructions while also portraying how ascetic adepts embodied the practice. Thus, he constructs an economy in which the possession of the image of the Last Judgment attains the highest value. Within Climacus's commentary on apocalyptic memory, he makes a move typical of the literature surrounding the Desert Fathers. He speaks through an elder's voice, that of an anonymous monk who embodied the kind of rugged, isolated ideal, and makes the following gnomic statement, quote, "This is what an Egyptian monk once said to me. If it ever happened that I was inclined to offer some luxury to this carcass of mine, the remembrance of death that had been so firmly established in my heart would stand before me like a judge, and a most wondrous thing Even if I wanted to push it aside, I simply could not do so, end quote. Here, through clear hyperbole, Climacus raises the relatively harmless metaphor of the stamp to give the process of memory retention a far more difficult physicality, deploying another term, pagiosin. From pagiosis, the term tends to connote a process of ensnaring, fastening, even anchoring. And this sense of hardened retention is a way of conceiving yet another ancient phenomenon related to memory's working, the state called catalepsis. That is the focused apprehension or acquisition of a form or perceptual phenomenon, a comprehension in this case so great that it leads to belief. The key point in the Climacus passage is that catalepsis becomes a sensation, a feeling akin to bearing an immovable melancholic weight. What Climacus does here is renders that acquisition, indeed the pained catalepsis of the Last Judgment, a critical symptom to acquire. It is the envious reserve of the nearly sanctified, rugged Egyptian aesthetic, made legendary in his account. That the mnemonic image, however, and its attendant fear could cohere into an immovable sensation or phantasmic presence leads Climacus to place fear within another category. Through the monk's voice, he calls the permanent installation of the image a thaumaston, connoting the marvelous or the wondrous. The critical importance of this term as an aesthetic criterion in ancient and Hellenistic Greek art has attracted much excellent scholarship. Yet a similar aesthetic economy of wonder opens in Climacus's passage. The monk marvels at this permanent phantasm cohering into a semi-autonomous form and staring back at him with the authority of a judge. In this case, wonder or thauma does not carry our modern positive inflection of a kind of enchantment, but rather cuts to something strange, even threatening, yet nevertheless alluring. Thauma is intimately connected with phobos, but a thauma, especially in Homer, but a thauma generates thaumateidzeion, that is the action of marveling, an event of suspending time in wondrous immersion. To the monk initiate, the physical degree to which this anchorite cultivated fear simultaneously posed an authentic experience, in orthopraxis so perfected that it altered both his soma and psyche. But nowhere does Climacus make fear more into a mystical symptom than in the strange following passage. Again, in another anecdote, an Egyptian monk becomes an exemplar. Extolling the practice of death meditation, Climacus recounts, quote, another monk, this time an inhabitant of the place called Tholos, would go into ecstasy at the thought of death, and when the brothers found him, they had to raise him up and carry him, scarcely breathing, like someone who had fainted or suffered an epileptic fit. Climacus thus makes the experience of fear legendary and marvelous again. Entranced focus and concentration on the image of Last Judgment leads to ekstasin, the loss of stasis. This tremorous panic described here is far beyond the pathos of fear as defined by Aristotle. Rather, it is far more akin to inspired ekplexis, to mystical possession, to inspired mania. It also perhaps is calling to mind the uncontrolled friquet of the shivering martyr. Climacus is not saying, however, that this frenzied state was negative. The fearful trance was an aspect of the holy man's allure, his means of attaining transcendence. The Climax reveals how the production of such ekstasin and imagination followed a rigorous, regimented formalism. That is, a formalism following figures or based around figures that the reader could reproduce in his meditation. In all accounts of Last Judgment imagery, the following passage from Climacus's guide has never been connected to the strange bricolage of spaces that we find on all painted examples. Indeed, in the seventh step, entitled On Mourning, Climacus gives a detailed mnemonic map, a stochastic list of topoi for eschatological remembrance. And I quote, never stop imagining and examining the abyss of dark fire, its cruel minions, the merciless, inexorable judge, the limitless chaos of subterranean flames, narrow descents down to underground chambers and yawning gulfs, in other such images. Then lust in our souls may be checked by immense terror, by surrender to incorruptible chastity and receive that non-material light which shines beyond all fire. End quote. Specifically using the Greek term ikonos from the verb ikonizo, Climacus describes the process of envisioning here as a proper meditative praxis. And he envisions seeing judgment in the mind's eye not as a discrete event or as a single image, but as a ceaseless process. And this is the kind of image I think Climacus wanted his readers to imagine the monks, turning the monks into these kind of entranced people. Clearly, this passage is indebted to the concept of memory structured around topoi, familiar since Simonides, but any resemblance between Climacus and the ancient memory palace has now been deconstructed. He seeks to confer a strange geometry and physics to the underworld, breaking it down into a series of voids, drops, chambers, and gulfs. Like the strange cells and the divisions on the ivory, the post-mortem world is imagined as dimensional and architectonic. It comprises underground fires and fissures and is bottomless. There is also an imagined sense of motion, descents and paths underground into awful chambers. The passage also bears resemblance to Tochabi's panel in two respects. Of course, like the ivory, there are the same loci, which you see on the right, the cruel judge, flames, and underground chambers. But most importantly, there is also the shared random order, a kind of bricolage in the composition. Little wonder then that Climacus imparts total mastery as a kind of disorientation of space and time. That is, this is an ekphrasis of ceaseless motion and pummeling effect. The competing viewpoints and crossing perspectives opened in Climacus's ekphrasis were themselves generating an effect of suspension. And that sense of constant, overwhelming motion undoes the subject's control, an effect that ancient and Byzantine sources call ekplexis, from ekpleso. Our word astonishment can clarify ekplexis only if we appreciate the profound physical and spatial aspects of the experience. In the Topica, for example, Aristotle defined ekplexis as an excess of thauma, or wonder. Ekplexis was a state of entrancement, a form of ekstasin, or again, being led out of stasis. A painted page from a later Sinai manuscript of Climacus's treatise brings this material together and illustrates this kind of praxis of embodied imagining. A figure against gold contemplates three block-like spaces. Nyambala rightly argues that these blocks resemble Tochabi's panel. However, the source of the illumination's image of the judgment spaces certainly comes from that harrowing passage just quoted. What is curious about this illumination, however, is where it appears in the manuscript and in the sequence of the steps. The scene does not accompany the passage on the mnemonic conjuration. Rather, it appears several sections later in the book in the step devoted to mastering the vice of insensibility. The implication is that the monk at this point has absorbed the image of last judgment into his armature and can wield it in instances of temptation. The standing figure faces the imagined topoi, enlivened by color. And you can see the bodies kind of floating in molten fire and then the dark chamber of skulls underneath it. He turns his back, however, from the temptations of the table. The miniature confirms how the act of imagining supplements the regimen of mortification based on the sympathetic relationship between mind and body. Climacus assumed the sublime status of spiritual authority, not just for the monks that heard his treatise read each year. When we turn to the cultural productions in Constantinople in the 10th and 11th century, we can see how the Climax assumed profound allure. It impelled the challenge for the aristocracy's pursuit of spiritual perfection. This brings us back to the world of objects with which I opened and with which we may associate a work like the ivory carving. For example, the Emperor Leo VI not only read Climacus, he wrote scholia on the text. The emperor even went as far as mimicking the Sinai authority by writing a guide to the ascetic life himself. Leo's treatise survives as the De Administratione Animarum, with a pattern for the guidance of souls in Escorial Sigma 2, 10, and 1 manuscript. And I can thank Theodora Antonopoulou for clarifying aspects of this kind of penitential production associated with Leo. However, at least 12 manuscripts extending back to the Barberini anthology, the late 10th century Barberini anthology, associate a certain poem with the Emperor Leo. In it, the emperor uses the Anacreontic meter, a form associated with poems of wine and love, to summon last judgment in sensuous detail. This poem falls within a category Antonia Giannulli has called the catanictic genre, from catanixis, the practice of piercing or self-reproach for sin. The affective poem, the catanictic verse, finds precedent in the hymns of Andrew of Crete and Romanos. But the Hodarian catanicticon attributed to Leo VI consists of 30 strophes of 6 octosyllabic verse and arranged according to alphabetical acrostics. These words are beyond a mere lament for sin, however. Terms for terror and vision are legion throughout the work. And here I'm just projecting a scan of the earliest manuscript witness in Venice. As the work is attested in the index of the Barberini Grec 310, but does not survive in the manuscript as it exists today in the Vatican. Leo mixes in his poem anguished desires for forgiveness with a remarkable vocabulary for fearful vision, otherworldly space, dreadful motion. And the poem itself is far too long to quote in its entirety, so I just took some verses out. The first being, ouch, ouch, how the earth that has been torn apart under the thrust of supernal forces screeches, uncovering the horrible places that are now hidden. Alas, what a view that will be, end quote. He then tells his soul, quote, to look at the tombs with smooth carvings, full of shadows and darkness, a bottomless abyss, end quote. He then imagines later on in the poem a seismic rupture. And here you can see the 2 verses to the left. Quote, from afar the judge will come to you, seated on the clouds, shaking the world from the underworld recesses, upsetting even the air with formidable power. A whirlwind will sweep away the mountains and make the valleys disappear, and in the unquenchable fire, the ground will be incinerated by the face of the Lord, who comes and judges the earth. End quote. In his authorial vividness, Leo, or the poet we call Leo, aspires to share in the authoritative vision of the Last Judgment, the plummeting experience described by Climacus. He is here exposing in verse an orthopraxis of fear. And despite his crestfallen position and self-blame, he is replicating his imagination in words. He is expressing mastery over the generation of phantasmic images, as well as expressing a kind of inspired fear. Leo's poetic formalism aspires to what the ivory materializes: the containment of the cataclysmic, the unthinkable into miniature form. Likewise, the ivory's competing viewpoints in unearthed, uncovered sepulchral spaces mirror Leo's and Climacus's suspended amazement. It's a kind of unique perspective that's being described and mirrored here. Yet this point leaves things at the purely visual level. And here I end with some further arguments. A work like the Ivory was magnifying devotional focus not only through scale, but through the effect of relief. If the Last Judgment image could be appreciated for transmitting a specific mnemonic figure or set of figures, how might relief itself relate to this economy between fantasia and aesthesis, or sensation? The ivory makes permanent what the words conjure as a phantasm. Might this transformation of the image into matter on the ivory demonstrate something in itself, like the painful process of inscribing a memory? The recognition of the immense difficulty and force inherent to carving an unwieldy substance parallels the spiritual work of fear and mnemonic sealing. Relief takes things to a level far beyond the wax imprint underlying Aristotelian models of memory. If the ivory raises up for contemplation the ontology of memory as a material thing, then it also models how mnemonic acquisition of the image itself requires that the image be carved, if painfully so, by mind and body. The sheer amount of disjuncture, the attention to minutiae, hardly conceals on the ivory the labor of making, of carving, of chipping out what seems to be impossibly small details. This is not the acheiropoieton, but the product of an unmistakably dexterous performance. In this respect, we may understand the piece as modeling how the work of conjuring Last Judgment required profound psychophysical labor. Ivory, however, need not only be the substance manifesting relief's effects of dimensionality. As Robert Nelson has argued from on-site experience I haven't had the privilege to gain, an icon's gold ground was hardly a ground at all. Within the candlelit dramaturgy at Sinai, rather, gold served to give autonomy to a figure's form, to accentuate it, perhaps even to separate it. Under such lighting, the disjunctions between painted topoi and gold space on Tochabi's icon would have simulated the tensions between positive and negative space in the experience of relief. This series of effects can only have enhanced the oniric quality of the image while offering surface effects evocative of imprinting. The perception of these works as indexical of difficult facture relates to a phenomenon originating again in ancient rhetoric. Held in high esteem in Byzantium, as Stratis Papaianou has explored, that effect is enargeia. In one respect, enargeia, or vividness, emerges from the depth and accretion of detail in a description, or in these works. Enargeia enlivened rhetorical descriptions like an ekphrasis. But enargeia had another shade of meaning and significance. Ancient and Byzantine sources marveled how the phenomenon allowed poets and orators, to quote Ruth Webb, quote, to write as though vivid language can actually give access to the mind which gave rise to it, end quote. Discussing Virgil, Quintilian, a parallel source in my opinion, reflected, quote, had the poet not thoroughly conceived an image of death to be able to say of Antores, quote, and dying he remembered sweet Argos, end quote. Thus, for vividness to unfold, the poet had to have aroused the same anguish in himself. To enter this state was the precondition for his creativity and his genius. The materialization of fearful images, I think, worked in parallel, perhaps even more immediately. Fear supported the recognition of the image maker's authority because the image forces us to share his viewpoint and in part the fearful force of his psychosomatic process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for your paper. Ravi's rich and insightful paper is not about emotions. It is about fear as anesthesis, a sensation, and the cultural experience of the Last Judgment in Byzantium. Despite tapping on the currently blooming field of the history of emotions, Ravi is taking the discourse further by understanding fear as a psychosomatic condition that would reach its full potentials within a process of a meditative immersion. This process places the person authoring an image of the Last Judgment on the front row, and on the second, the dialogue between creator and beholder. The process itself is located firmly in the domain of memory. Also, according to Ravi, images of the Last Judgment are another forms of ekphrasis, that is, creative renderings of one's actual or imaginative experiences embellished with enargeia or vividness. Building on Aphthonius, vividness is the bridge joining the person making a cultural object and the person beholding it. Also, vividness, as an essential ingredient of ekphrasis, completes the immersion of the beholder on the described topic. To put it plainly, an ekphrasis with all its attributes is in fact the metaverse of the Byzantines. Thus, Ravi correctly understands fear as an experience involving both the intellect and the body, Ekphrasis, like the metaverse, allows the construction of affective realities to force viewers into a state of empathy, including body and mind, and an immersive experience involving senses and the intellect. It is a state that addresses the entirety of the human being, who, according to the Byzantines, is nothing else, quote, than an embodied intellect, unquote, and I translate here, pneuma logikon se sarkomenon. Ravi also argued that the allure of fear trickled down in the spiritual hierarchy from a high monastic sphere that, down to thus reaching the palace. I'm sorry for that. That forces us only to consider further the role of church sacraments as an overarching experience filling the lives of the Byzantines and dictating orthopractic actions. Receiving the sacraments is essentially a preparatory step towards the salvation that is to be decided during the Last Judgment. As Stefanos Alexopoulos has noted, fear before the sacraments has been present in private communions prayers already from the 5th century. In prayers recited before receiving the sacraments, the Byzantines would have expressed their fear before God in a way similar to the personal manner of the images and texts that Ravi analyzed. Except for remarkable images, Ravi also looked closely at exciting texts. The metrical inscription on the Sinai hexaptic that we can also part of it, like the image of it, we can actually see on our screen at the moment. The metrical inscription on the Sinai hexaptic was the first one. Looking back at the inscription, we immediately realize that it is made of a series of commonplaces. Daniel's vision is an omnipresent reference in eschatological texts, including epigrams. Translating an image from the intellect to the material world is another commonplace in epigrammatic poetry. The use of topoi is another manifestation of a maker's orthopraxis, the kind of action Ravi has been looking for at his paper. The image's creator knows not only the correct beliefs, but also the right actions to interact with the divine. When the poem refers to the action on the lower line of the inscription, he states that he reverently painted the parousia, which of course is a term referring to the second coming, but also in a more literal sense, it also refers to a presence, to Christ's presence. The sensual component is further emphasized in the monograms surrounding the cross that are interpreted as the cross, but although this is implied, grants the light of Christ to all. Stavros, phos Christou, charίζει πάση. So if you remember from the slide that Ravi saw, we have the, thank you so much for that. Okay. So on the top of the icon, we have part of the epigram. The epigram continues on the second part, but in the middle where we have the cross, on all the four sides, we can see some letters. These letters should be interpreted exactly as the cross that is implied grants the light of Christ to all. So, phos Christou charίζει πάσιν. So Ravi is only right to emphasize that fear before the second judgment, mentioned in the first line of the text, was a condition and an experience of aesthesis or sensation. Coming back to the monographs, the first word is phos, is something that you're supposed to see, something that you're supposed to experience with your senses. A second remarkable text Rabbi discussed today is a Catanyctic alphabet attributed to Leo the Wise. Written in around 900, is, according to Mark Laxterman, the third in chronological order of Catanyctic alphabets in octosyllables. The poem itself is entitled A Catanyctic Song in Alphabets, an Odarion Catanycticon κατά στοιχείων. Odarion is the key term here. The reference to a song, Odarion, is not perchance, as according to at least some of the manuscripts, to 3 out of 12 manuscripts, the text was set to the melody of a popular exapostillarium. In other words, and as the most recent editor of the poem, Federica Cicolella, notes, Leo's poem engages in a cosplay with liturgical poetry. That is, in combination with the relatively accessible language of the text, that entails an intense performative, ritualized aspect. Leo's popular poem, as Ravi mentioned, it survives in at least 12 manuscripts, and the more secluded Sinai inscription have more in common than it initially seemed. Both texts have a melodic component. Leo's poem is a song, and the dodecasyllables of the epigram would render its rhythmical attributes. Also, both texts are written in an easily accessible but seemingly very elaborate language. And both texts call for the strong emotions of both creator and the beholder. To put it differently, the expression of fear is part of a ritualized experience enacted through performance. A ritualized experience is a synesthetic event, and among the elements of a ritual is also awe, an expression of fear. Finally, I need to ask Ravi, the Last Judgment is the defining moment in the life of a Byzantine. It is thus inevitably connected to the fear of the unknown, of the future, of Christ's unpredictable reaction. Most of your texts associate fear with pain, but is there anything more in that all gloomy situation? Is there any hope in fear? Thank you again, Ravi, for your truly wise paper. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your feedback and really wonderful insights that I've tried my best to write down. My microphone, I assume, is still on, yes?
Yes.
Okay. There's much to work with, and just maybe later in the discussion, we can go back to this issue of the kind of embodied recitation of something like these kataniktic verses and how that activates a song-like effect, and how that might parallel to the images and the trance-like aspect. But to address your question about, because even looking at the other side of these images, you have the image of paradise, the object of desire, counterbalancing, these topoias, kind of hellscapes, consistently reproduced across examples, yeah? And that inevitably kind of offers a counterbalance of assurance to the viewers. Now, the thing is that in Climacus, in Leo, and various other texts, the Triodion poets, fear is the primary sensation to be evoked, fricae and trembling. But in the experience of katanixis itself, the promise, I believe, in this experience is best understood again through the ancient model of catharsis. And that's the promise of purification and temporary relief, perhaps, of eschatological fear in the through the induction of fear. So when we look at what is being sung for the 40 martyrs, even in Hagia Sophia, it's the psalm, "You took us through fire and ice and led us to a place of relief," right? So this becomes a model also for how these sensations could release themselves into a point of clarification. And I think invested in the act of beholding is not just this perpetual fear, but also the secondary component that you ask about, yeah, regarding cathartic clarification. Now, this again brings us to the point between what is a pathos and what is aistasis, right? So are we dealing with a kind of tragic concept of catharsis or a near medical conception of catharsis? And I'm now talking about, Greek ancient notions of these phenomena. And I think when we talk about katanixis as a ritual, that ties all of this material together, an orthopraxis that ties this material together, the experience aligns with this notion of a kind of purgation effect to release tears, to release endless amounts of tears. This is, again, something that I don't talk about in this paper, but I will elsewhere, is essential to Climacus and indeed the confirmation that penthos is occurring. But this itself, the release of tears that's also throughout Leo's poem, offers that kind of almost joyful clarification of sins being cleansed. And we also have this language, I think, that you would obviously have encountered in your own work about sin, but also a language of cleansing and transformation. So that's the happy ending to all of this.
But the transformation has to always come through tears and fear. But the other thing that I was kind of struggling to understand is also when I was reading Leo's poem is kind of what is the relation between like pain, okay, and fear. Does the fear of pain is what creates the fear, or the pain is what brings the fear?
Yeah, because
I mean, in most of your texts, and also in the beautiful images that you have shown, pain it seems to go hand in hand with fear, and
yes,
that relation seems to be quite pronounced throughout.
I think the accretion of details and threats in the judgment spaces are generating this loop of threats about pain, and then trying to counter that pain through responding with fear. So I think, I'm not sure that if you look at Leo's text, for example, there are so many clear distinctions between fear and pain as they are kind of overlapping in this kind of generation of imaginative projection, right?
And how personal do you think is this fear?
Well, that's where I think authority comes into play, is that I'm arguing here that fear is not when I say it's not a response, I mean it's a kind of it's an intangible phenomenon that people desperately wanted to attain. So you have instances, and the analogs or the monumental images, indeed, of the Pantocrator image that I showed, that would have been basically the ground or anchor of the entire community or that worshiping body. And then the rise of these smaller objects that personalize this symptom also as something, hotly desired to be possessed, as an expression or even mode of self-fashioning.
But this self-fashioning is just, I mean, you in your paper, you also mentioned that there is a lot of work that has happened, that in the last few years has been realized in relation to personhood, to the ego question, and I was wondering, where is your stance? So where fear comes to all that?
With regard to the recent research,
to the personhood, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've drawn, for example, if you look at the example that Derpich opens his book on, the epigrams later material, it's a 13th century example of, and the name of the monk is escaping me, but a personal correspondence where someone is asking for a series of epigrams to accompany a scene of the Last Judgment, and the monk is providing him almost with a personal therapy for the fear by giving the poems personally. That also shows kind of monastic authorship of these things, and how these transactions were occurring. And that's a great example, and Derpich is not focusing necessarily in that book on fear, but is considering this kind of alignment with exemplars. And Derek Kruger, in his study of the liturgical texts and the scripts of the Triodion, is doing something similar. We're entering into personal alignment with bigger exemplars, or using objects as means of self-fashioning, or we're able to express or enter into experiences of fear beyond simply, what maybe the field had been focusing on before, which is epigrams as evidence of viewer response. Okay, people were afraid because they read this thing, right? Rather, they're showing a far more complex approach to these problems. That's in art history and in religious studies. And I've drawn on that, that material has inspired me to kind of look at these earlier objects like the ivories, thinking about how devotional alignment is itself productive of, entering that viewpoint, is it's self-productive of a kind of identity orientation. So does that get to the question?
Yeah, so what I'm trying, I guess, to kind of frame here is again the big question of the self, especially in the self in the earlier centuries that you are talking about. So before becoming the very self, if you like. And again, your text, but also your images are closely connected to the liturgy, where in the liturgy, especially in the canons, you have a very strong ego and very strong I and very strong we in it. So I was just wondering how that can actually work with the interpretive model that you suggest.
Yeah, I'm still with this paper. I was really thinking about who is making these things and how do we come to perceive or recognize who the maker was and what is the maker's eye, basically. And that's obviously an infamously difficult question, maybe a crazy one to start thinking about, given the such little amount of text that survives attesting to artistic self-fashioning. So this is why the Tohabi panel is so precious to me, because of this first person, which to my mind, if you read this, is a very, very bold claim he's actually making. It's underneath, and this is this kind of beauty of the language, underneath the humble supplication is this claim that he's transferring such a profound vision in such a small space and time. That in itself has far deeper epigrammatic precedent, even before Byzantium, the miniature or the reduction of macro into micro. But I mean, I think when you're asking about the issue of liturgy as forming a kind of subjectivity, I was not thinking so much in this talk about how that could inform us with the recognition of the image maker's share,
At the same time, what I was trying to understand is exactly, again, the big question of who are the creators and who is this person that is speaking. So let's look again at your poem, at the poem that you have in the Sinai Hexaptych, which is a beautiful, beautiful poem, but at the same time is created with topoi. It's a Lego. It's a Lego of topoi. And where the I comes into the whole discussion and where the we comes, that's what I'm trying to get to, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, this is basically what could be considered, where is the broader eschatological imaginary coming from? Are you improvising? And this is actually, Professor Nelson, there's a book on the conference about artistic authority or what is the artist in Byzantium, I think from 2004. And he uses this kind of concept of improvisation within standards. And that, I think, is also what you're getting at with, what are the sort of discursive boundaries possible in an epigram? The image is taken maybe from, images transmitted into liturgy, and that's where he's sort of defining his authorial subjecthood or subjectivity. So I absolutely agree there. But when it gets to hyper-personal experience, that's where I kind of fall back on Climacus, because Climacus, again, is turning all of these phenomena into very supernatural things, I think beyond liturgical space, right?
Yeah. So, okay, so it's beyond the liturgical space, but at the same time, Climacus has a community. So I'm trying to get away from the beholder's example, interpretive example, and trying to look at the both the images but also the text with your interpretive example. And I'm just still like trying to get where I guess is like where I'm trying to understand more than anything else is how the community comes into that. Because all these people were not writing just for themselves, they were not painting just for themselves, one would think, but there is this dialogue.
Let me just note that point. This is opening a difficult question also about how the Leo poem would engage a broader public as well. I mean, that's something we have very little idea about, right?
We do, but it's not the only one. It's in a series of catanyctic of catanyctic poems, and okay, it's one of the earliest examples, but it's not the last. It's not the last. I mean, Mark Laxman's recent book, he elaborates on that, and there is more recent work that has happened by Giulia Paoletti on 14th century catanyctics. Really, really wonderful work. But then again, according to the established scholars, there comes again the question of who is the person who is speaking in these catanyctic poems. So with Leo's poem, you have a beautiful situation that the poem has been like extremely popular. 12 manuscripts for a Byzantine text is a lot. It doesn't happen that much. Of course, is when we're speaking about liturgy, it's a different story, but that is a very specific text. And still you have 12 manuscripts. That quite strikes me, if you like. So I'm really trying to understand who fears here. Who is the fear? Who is expressing the fear? Is Ioannis? Is it his community? Is it who expresses the fear, and how does this relate to the orthopractic, or to the orthopraxis? That
well, I mean, in this respect, I would maybe take things back to the level of the painting. That the painting itself is a communal object that's grounding the ritual sense of time, if we're reconstructing in that respect. And that's basically cutting to the core of the argument that, you know, for its viewership, it would have inevitably also, even unconsciously, transmitted the fact that the painting was, you know, associated with the master monk. So this would take us a little bit away from the concept of poetry as an aesthetic thing to a rather old school, and this was a point that was kind of haunting my whole talk, which is the concept of an image as a didactic aid. And this is a notion that our field has moved quite a bit away from, at least medieval art history, that no, the image is not just a didactic aid. But what I'm trying to show is that in the recognition of how this poses an orthopraxis for imagination, there's also a mediation of the recognition that a master was imparting the image to the community. And that's what I'm really trying to get at with the concept of artistic authority. And I think that, you know, if we draw the parallel, at least with the verses, as you're doing, it works slightly differently. But nevertheless, I think there is a claim in even something like Leo's reproduced poem that this person is a master of the imagination. He's a master of phantasma. And in that respect, if it is addressing a community, it's modeling for that community a kind of didacticism of how to generate, you know, these phantasms or this imaginative process at the very highest level. And that's also what Climacus is doing, right? You know, he himself is called scholastikos in many manuscripts subsequently after the latter is written down. So that maybe, you know, I should have clarified that a bit more in the paper, that's also at stake when I'm talking about rhetorical effects. It is an issue of sort of aesthetics and even reception and pleasure, but also returning to this idea of the didactic aid or the didactic object as something far more strange than this dry method of imparting dogma, right? You're imparting a vision to your community. And in that respect, you know, we don't have so many texts talking about the profound experience of the artist's talent, but this gets us almost close to that in the sense that these are masters of the imaginary in the fact that they are laying these pictures down, right?
Yep, and also, I mean, coming back to the point about what you were just talking about the didactic aspect, and the question of fantasia as well. It really, really struck me as, I mean, in a good sense, how beautifully you have connected fear with memory. and how the place of fear is memory. And probably you know about that, but also I think the Byzantines also in question and answers, they were actually saying that fear is an epolypsis, a kind of apprehension of something that is to be remembered, 20 momenus. So it's kind of it's just a really beautiful, like, if you like, research line, I guess, to move forward in order perhaps to understand how that relates to my previous question regarding community as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to trace an economy here where really this fear almost becomes and again, the link being an interpretation based on this kind of didacticism being posed by the image, that this is intimately associated with what these people believed was philosophy, right? That fear and the mastery of phantasma and the mastery of knowledge of a knowledge of the Last Judgment, even if that is indeed imparted through the liturgy by certain charismatic figures or charismatic sources, is itself, akin to a degree of stimulation like philosophy. And I think, and that gets to the broader problem that I addressed in the beginning of the paper, which is when we look too much on fear as response, we forget the cultural conditions that are raising it within a kind of economy that I'm talking about. So.
And didacticism, again, it requires a community, so that's perhaps.
And didacticism is always kind of like associated with a sort of art history that we've kind of moved away from, maybe, but I think it's far stranger than we would recognize it as. Yeah.
Perfect. And
Thank you, both of you. I noticed a certain pause here, and we're reaching 1:30, so I interjected myself. I thank you, Ravinder, for an excellent paper that raises so many problems and so many issues that I think many of us are going to be thinking about it for a long time. And Foteini for engaging this difficult material and helping us understand its implications. She, at one moment, right here at the end, I wrote down in my notes, congratulated Ravinder for a beautiful research line or a beautiful research agenda, which I think I see here developing between the two of you around poetry and art, and making something much more fecund in the sense of fertile and promising than that old term beholder's share, which was conceptually limited, which both of you have shown is conceptually limited. So it's my pleasure to thank you once more, and also to remind our audience that our next lecture is in December 9 by Brigitte Pitarakis, and the respondent will be Celine Unluonen from Oberlin. It's possible, if we can get all the ducks in a row, so to speak, that my lecture will come on December 2, that is the 2nd of December. But we don't have that all worked out. But in any event, a notice will be given of that lecture, my lecture, as well as Brigitte's. So thank you very much today, and I look forward to reading much more of your scholarship in the future. Thank you.